Hi, welcome everyone to the week 7 presentation for ME150. This week we are focusing on just one chapter of study, which I always kind of like. Chapter 9, and the focus of chapter 9 is physicians' public duties and responsibilities. To me, the title sounds kind of boring, if you want to know my personal opinion, but once you dive into the information, it's all about vital statistics and all kinds of things that I find kind of interesting. So hopefully you do too. We're going to start actually with vital statistics, and let's talk about what that is. This is information collected by government officials to assess population trends and need, so kind of get a status quo of how people are doing. So we collect information such as live births. Live births are actually reported to the state registrar, and that's important to know for your quiz. Deaths, fetal death and induced abortions. Generally, birth and death certificates are not required for fetal deaths occurring prior to 20 weeks of gestation. So that's an important little fact to know. Also, changes in individuals' civil status. Things that are not listed on here that I want you to also know that we collect information on are rape and assaults. So let's next talk about the use of vital statistics. It's used by educational institutions, government agencies, research scientists, they look for trends, and even private industries will use this information. So healthcare practitioners are responsible for gathering and filing many of the vital statistics collected by the states and federal governments, which is why it's going to be important for you all to know the process in case you get involved in that process. Looking more specifically at death certificate information, there's certain information that has to be on there, and then there's certain information that's not required. One thing that your quiz focuses on that's not required is you don't have to know the deceased's complete medical history. But what they do want to know is the disease or injury or complication that caused the death. The date and time of death is important, as well as the place of death, pregnancy and female death, and if an autopsy was performed. Your quiz also gives a lot of scenarios this week surrounding who would complete the death certificate, so I'm going to give some examples. If a patient dies of natural causes while under his or her doctor's care, it's important if the patient's under a doctor's care, the attending physician is responsible for completing the medical portion of the death certificate. If the physician attending to the deceased before the death, then if they're attending to them, such as they're in the hospital, they would also be okay to sign the death certificate. So it would be legal for the physician to sign the death certificate if they were the attending physician. If death occurs under normal circumstances and the body is released to the funeral home, so let's say the person died at home and it seems like it was under normal circumstances, the mortician is then responsible for filing the death certificate with the state. So let's talk about deaths that could be subject to autopsy. So anything that's possibly due to criminal causes obviously would have an autopsy. An unattended death where no one was present when the person died, sometimes that will lead to autopsy. Due to causes undetermined by the physician, if the physician can't figure out why the person died, then we need to investigate further. And obviously violent or otherwise suspicious death. So a medical examiner, who is frequently a pathologist, may order and perform an autopsy. And then let's talk about this. If a person dies as a result of something like a carjacking, so basically some criminal, the coroner would be responsible for signing the death certificate in that case. So lots of questions revolving around scenarios this week, so I want you to be well prepared for that. Forensics medicine. This is an important term to know the definition of. This is a division of medicine that incorporates law and medicine and involves medical issues or medical proof at trials having to do with malpractice, crimes, and accidents. Public health statutes. Remember that word statutes just means laws. So we're talking about public health laws next. The power of the states to initiate public health statutes is inferred from the 10th Amendment of the United States. Now, I want you to remember the 10th Amendment, and I want you to know it's inferred, meaning it's not directly stated. Federalism, that's an important term to know. It's sharing of power among federal, state, and local governments. So let's put that into an example. A state retains police powers not expressly granted to the federal government. That would be an example of federalism. They help guarantee the health and well-being of the citizens. So that's why we have those public health statutes. They're probably things we don't think about on a daily basis, but we're probably pretty happy that these statutes exist. So let's talk about some provisions. They guard against unsanitary conditions in public facilities, always a good thing. They inspect establishments where food and drink are processed and sold. They exterminate pests and vermin that can spread disease. I'm personally thankful for that. They check water quality, which is a huge thing if you know kind of what's been going on in Flint, Michigan in the recent years. You can understand why having clean public water is an important thing. They set up measures of control for certain diseases. They require physicians, school nurses, and other healthcare workers to file certain reports for the protection of citizens. So your quiz also focuses on an example. The state of Virginia checks all restaurants to make sure the conditions are sanitary. That would be a good example of a public health statute. Again, they inspect establishments where food and drink are processed and sold. That's that second bullet point on there. Now let's look at how laws affect public health issues. Here's a big chart, and it does come from your textbook, so I don't expect you to know all this. This information is more informational than it's going to be helpful for your quiz. The one thing I do want to point out that your quiz focuses on, some of these require behavioral change on the part of public. So things like child safety seat laws, that's an example of a state law that requires a behavioral change on the part of the public to adhere to that law. The National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act. Let's talk about that for a second. It was enacted in 1986. Again, you don't have to know that date, it's just informational. But it was created by the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program to create protection for vaccine manufacturers. And that is important to know for your quiz. So parents or guardians are informed of risks associated with each vaccine. Normally, you are given a sheet about the vaccine and asked to sign it. Parents must sign consent forms allowing healthcare practitioners to administer the vaccine. They want to make sure that you know the ins and outs of what is going on with a vaccine before they give it to your child. Reportable diseases and injuries. Reportable diseases are determined by each state, so that tells me that it's going to vary from state to state in some situations. Sexually transmitted diseases are reported when diagnosed. The main reason for that is to treat others who may be infected. It's not that we're just nosy and we want to know this information. It's that we want to keep the public safe and help protect other people that may be infected. One example of an STI, which we refer to as a sexually transmitted infection that is not reportable, is cervical cancer. So I do want you to know that cervical cancer is not a reportable STI. HIV is a reportable STI. Notification to past and present sexual partners or needle-sharing partners is required. Also, communicable diseases reporting more stringent for patients who work with the public. So what that means is if you have a job as a waitress, the reporting of those communicable diseases is going to be even more stringent and more important because you have so much access to public people within your workplace. Let's talk about reportable injuries. I will tell you reportable injuries is not something that's covered on your quiz, but I think it's good information to know as being part of the healthcare system. These are the types of reportable injuries: assault, rape, domestic violence, whether it's child abuse, spousal abuse, or elder abuse. Those are all things that we are, as healthcare providers required to report. It's also important not only to report those, but to know what to look for. So that if we are encountering something, we know whether it could be something we need to report or not. So signs of abuse: unexplained fractures, repeated injuries, burns with unusual shapes, friction burns, bite marks, malnutrition or dehydration, or possible sexual abuse. These are all signs that we would want to be aware of to see if we do indeed need to report abuse. Next in the chapter was drug regulations, and drug regulations is enforced by the Drug Enforcement Administration, or the DEA, under something called the Controlled Substance Act. It provides 5 categories or schedules of drugs based on their potential for abuse. So drugs are categorized based on how addictive, basically, they could be. Here's the drug schedule for controlled substances, and I know it's kind of small to read. It should be from your book, Table 9-3. But you can see there's schedules 1 through 5, and it does categorize what each schedule says. I will help you out by saying this is not something that's on your quiz. This is informational purposes only. I would highly recommend reading through it because it is important information, but it's not something you need to study for your quiz. Ensuring security is important, especially if you have any kind of scheduled drugs that are within your office. So keep all controlled substances in a locked cabinet or safe. Remind the physician to keep his or her black bag, which is basically their doctor bag, in a safe place. Keep all blank prescriptions, especially those used for narcotics, under lock and key. They should not be left laying around where anyone could just walk by and decide they wanted to take some of those. Order prescription blanks that are serially numbered. That way you can see if something's missing. Report to the physician any behavior by a patient that would suggest an attempt to secure addictive drugs. Check patient records to verify all prescriptions that may have been questioned by the pharmacist. So we want to make sure that everything's on the up and up in terms of those controlled substances. At this point, it concludes the highlights of the information from our chapter this week. Make sure you do read that chapter in full. As always, do make sure you do your discussion, your quiz, as well as your assignment, and turn it in by Sunday. Read the From the Instructor document for this week to find out what you need to turn in for your assignment. And as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to seek me out, as I'm always here to help you. Our reference for this week was your textbook, as usual. Thank you so much for your time, and have a great week.